The 90s had a limit testing problem.
I'm the bad guy?
Yeah.
Amid a golden age for psychological thrillers, some movies slipped through the cracks, while pushing past accepted boundaries and exploring the darker edges of human behavior. This is our continued look at the darkest 90s thrillers, Part 3. Michael Douglas stars as William Foster, an unemployed defense worker who abandons his car in Los Angeles gridlock one sweltering morning and just starts walking. What begins as a quest to reach his daughter's birthday party turns into a rampage across the city as he accumulates weapons and grievances in equal measure.
And you, ma'am? How's the food? I think we have a critic.
Joel Schumacher shot the film in the spring of 1992, and production was interrupted by the Los Angeles riots that spring. Douglas later recalled watching the city burn from a distance as they wrapped filming. When the movie opened in February 1993, it hit a nerve audiences weren't entirely comfortable with. But it earned $8 million opening weekend, topping the box office for 2 consecutive weeks, and eventually pulling in $96 million worldwide. Newsweek put Douglas on their cover under the headline, "White Male Paranoia." Critics couldn't agree on what the film was even trying to say, and the debate never really ended. Audiences in 1993 saw a man pushed too far by an indifferent system, while modern viewers increasingly see a portrait of entitlement and radicalization. The film doesn't resolve that tension, and they're both right. Before cementing herself as America's sweetheart in the mid-90s, Julia Roberts took a sharp left turn into domestic terror in Sleeping with the Enemy. She plays a woman trapped in an immaculate Cape Cod prison, married to a man whose obsession with perfectly arranged towels is the least of her worries. Patrick Bergin, who plays the husband, reportedly refused to speak to Roberts between takes to build authentic tension. He later recalled that the two would sit silently in the same room for half an hour before scenes, deliberately creating unease. Shot for $19 million during the spring of 1990 in Wilmington, North Carolina, the film opened in February 1991 and demolished box office records, earning $175 million worldwide and breaking the record for highest domestic opening with a female lead. Roger Ebert gave it just 1.5 stars, calling the promising first act a bait and switch that devolved into slasher conventions. But audiences disagreed vehemently with critics, and the shot of Roberts noticing the straightened bathroom towels became one of the decade's most replicated images. Red Rock West has one of the strangest resurrection stories in American film. John Dahl's neo-noir follows Nicolas Cage as a drifter who limps into a tiny Wyoming town looking for work and gets mistaken for a hitman. Dennis Hopper plays the actual hitman who shows up later, equally confused. Shot for approximately $7 million in Arizona during late 1991, the film should have been a modest theatrical success. Instead, the studio panicked because they had no idea how to market a film noir set in the modern West. Test screenings went poorly. Polygram gave up entirely and sold it directly to HBO, where it aired in the fall of 1993 and was then scheduled for video release in February 1994. That should have been the end of the story, but Bill Banning, who owned the Roxy Cinema in San Francisco, saw it at the Toronto Film Festival and became obsessed. He tracked down the rights holders and convinced them to let him book it at his single-screen theater in January 1994. It broke the venue's all-time box office record. So the film expanded to Los Angeles, then New York, becoming one of the only American releases to reach theaters after already airing on cable television. Sometimes a movie just refuses to die. Light Sleeper stars Willem Dafoe as a high-end drug courier in his 40s, working the dwindling end of Manhattan's cocaine trade while keeping a diary and wondering if he's wasted his entire life. Paul Schrader had been circling the same character for nearly 2 decades. In 1976, he wrote Taxi Driver, about a young man consumed by rage. In 1980, he directed American Gigolo, about a narcissist in his 30s. By 1992, he was ready for the third act of what he called his Man in a Room series. Schrader financed the first 3 weeks of pre-production with his own money because no studio would commit. According to a 1992 Filmmaker magazine interview, every major financier passed on the script, even with Defoe and Susan Sarandon attached. The film eventually scraped together about $5 million through foreign pre-sales and opened to just $46,000 in 3 theaters. But critics recognized something special, and Schrader himself has called it his most personal film. The lonely man who filled his diary with self-doubt would return decades later, transformed into the environmental terror of First Reformed. Shallow Grave announced that British cinema had found a new voice, and it did so by making you hate everyone on screen. Danny Boyle made it in Glasgow during the summer of 1993, and the setup is brutally simple. 3 Edinburgh roommates discover their new flatmate dead with a suitcase full of cash. Keeping the money means dismembering the body and burying it in the woods. What follows is a study in how quickly greed destroys friendship when nobody involved is particularly likable to begin with. Ewan McGregor, in his first starring role, plays the morally flexible journalist. Christopher Eccleston plays the accountant who draws the short straw for the dismemberment and proceeds to lose his mind in the attic while the other 2 carry on downstairs. The movie won the BAFTA for Best British Film and earned approximately $20 million worldwide, which was massive for a British indie at the time. It also launched the creative team that would reunite for Trainspotting 2 years later. In interviews included on the Criterion release, Boyle explained they wanted audiences to watch these people turn on each other without rooting for anyone's survival. They succeeded. Rush arrived in 1991 with a very different mission. Director Lily Feeney Zanuck, fresh off producing the Best Picture winner Driving Miss Daisy, made her feature debut with this adaptation of Kim Wozencraft's autobiographical novel A Libris, about undercover narcotics officers in 1970s Texas. Jennifer Jason Leigh and Jason Patric play cops who go deep into the drug underworld. Patrick reportedly injected himself on camera with saline and vitamins to capture authentic needlework. Leigh spent extensive time interviewing addicts about the specific sensations of heroin use at different stages of a high. Roger Ebert gave it 3 stars and called it the most harrowing love story about addiction since The Panic in Needle Park. What made Rush stand out wasn't just the performances. Eric Clapton composed the score during what would become the most devastating period of his life. His 4-year-old son Connor died in March 1991 during production, and Clapton channeled that grief into music that would eventually yield Tears in Heaven. The song debuted through the Rush soundtrack before becoming one of the defining ballads of the decade. Abel Ferrara's 1992 Descent into Hell follows Harvey Keitel as an unnamed New York cop who isn't just corrupt, he's actively destroying himself in real time. He snorts cocaine during crime scenes, smokes crack in his patrol car, that's everything he doesn't have on baseball games, and assaults teenagers he's pulled over for traffic violations. There's no redemption arc being set up, no moment where the script signals he might turn things around. Keitel reportedly stayed in character throughout the entire production, which was shot guerrilla style across the Bronx and Manhattan on roughly $1 million. Editor Anthony Redman admitted in interviews that they rarely bothered with film permits. The result earned an NC-17 rating that the production never successfully appealed, which meant most major theater chains wouldn't touch it. The film's centerpiece involves the lieutenant weeping naked in a church, having a hallucinatory encounter with Christ after investigating the assault of a nun. It's simultaneously grotesque and somehow sincere in its depiction of a man so far gone that spiritual intervention feels like his last option. 8mm closed out the 90s by asking a question most studio films wouldn't dare touch. What if snuff films are real? And what happens to the person who has to find out? Andrew Kevin Walker, riding high off Seven, sold Columbia Pictures a script about a private investigator hired by a widow to determine whether a film depicting her husband watching a young woman's murder is genuine. Joel Schumacher signed on to direct it after the Batman and Robin disaster, reportedly seeking something that would be considered career suicide. Nicolas Cage plays the investigator who descends into the underground world of Times Square peep shows and backroom producers, and the script doesn't offer him an exit strategy that leaves him whole. The original cut ran over 3 hours and required multiple rounds of editing to escape an NC-17 rating, which tells you how far into the darkness it went. James Gandolfini plays a sleazy porn producer, and with The Sopranos premiering just 1 month earlier, audiences were only beginning to understand his range. The film's lasting image is Cage standing in front of a wall of degradation, realizing he can't unsee what he's learned, and the story offers no comfort about whether that knowledge was worth it. The Vanishing is a remake from 1988 by Dutch filmmaker George Sluicer, who made the original to widespread acclaim. So when Hollywood came calling with a $20 million budget, Jeff Bridges and Kiefer Sutherland, he agreed to try again. What makes the movie so disturbing is its clinical approach to obsession. Sutherland plays a man whose girlfriend disappears at a rest stop, and his need to know what happened to her becomes all-consuming. Bridges plays the abductor with an eerie matter-of-factness, a chemistry teacher who planned the kidnapping with the same methodical precision he'd bring to a lab experiment. The film builds anxiety through the inevitability of two men on a collision course, one driven by grief, and the other by a terrifying need to prove he can commit the perfect crime. Sluicer shot much of it in the Pacific Northwest, using vast, empty highways and isolated rest stops to create a sense that help is always just far enough away. Critics were divided on whether the American version captured what made the original so powerful. But there's something deeply uncomfortable about watching a man willingly walk toward the answer to a question that might destroy him. And the movie commits to that discomfort without flinching.